Margaret Sullivan knelt in her garden at the edge of her Montana property, the late afternoon sun warming her weathered hands as she carefully transplanted her prized heirloom tomatoes. A strange howl echoed from the dense forest beyond her fence, followed immediately by 3 sharp gunshots that shattered the peaceful mountain air. She froze, trowel in hand, as an unnatural silence descended over the woods. 5 years later, as Maggie sat across from Dr. Thompson in the small veterinary clinic, the words seemed to hang in the sterile air between them. "Margaret, I've completed the DNA analysis 3 times to be certain. Shadow isn't a German shepherd. He's a Canadian black wolf, one of the rarest apex predators in North America." The lab report trembled in Maggie's hands as she glanced through the window at her beloved companion waiting patiently in her truck, suddenly seeing him with new eyes that made her blood run cold. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Pine Ridge. Montana sat nestled against the shadowy edge of the northern Cascade Wilderness, a place where the boundary between civilization and untamed forest was as thin as morning mist. With just 800 residents, it was the kind of town where folks still left doors unlocked, and neighbors knew not just your name, but your troubles too. The main street consisted of little more than a general store, a diner, the sheriff's office, and Dr. Thompson's veterinary clinic, all built from the same weathered timber that seemed to grow straight from the Montana soil. Margaret Sullivan had called this place home for 37 years. Ever since Bobby brought her here as a young Army nurse he'd fallen in love with while recovering from a hunting accident. At 60, her auburn hair had faded to a steel gray that she wore cropped short for convenience, her tall frame still straight despite the arthritis that troubled her on cold mornings. The locals respected Maggie for her no-nonsense attitude and the skilled medical care she'd provided at the town clinic before retirement 3 years ago. The cabin she lived in had been in Bobby's family for generations, sitting on 40 acres that backed up against federal forest land. It was too big for one person. But after Bobby's fatal fall from Dixon Ridge 7 years ago, Maggie couldn't bear to leave. The silence of the empty rooms had become her unwelcome companion, punctuated only by the crackling fire in winter and the ticking of Bobby's grandfather clock year-round. Sheriff Frank Miller checked on her every Sunday after church, bringing fresh eggs from his chickens and news from town that Maggie pretended to care about. Dr. Abigail Thompson, 20 years Maggie's junior but her closest friend, drove out for coffee twice weekly, her concerned glances saying what her lips would not, that Maggie was withdrawing too much, the isolation eating at her like mountain wind against limestone. "You need something living in this house besides you and them tomato plants." Abby had told her countless times, someone to care for. Maggie would simply smile and respond the same way each time. "I've spent my life caring for people. Abby, I'm enjoying the quiet." But the truth was, the quiet had begun to echo too loudly in her heart. The day Maggie found Shadow began like most days in the 2 months since Bobby's funeral, with a determination to exhaust herself physically so she might actually sleep at night. She'd taken to hiking the forest trails behind her property, sometimes for hours, pushing herself up inclines that left her lungs burning and legs trembling. Bobby would have scolded her for going alone, but Bobby wasn't there to scold anymore. It was early October, the forest ablaze with autumn colors, when the whimpering stopped her in her tracks. At first, she thought it might be an injured bird or perhaps a fox kit. Following the sound off-trail, Maggie found herself pushing through a thicket of scrub oak until she emerged in a small clearing. There, beneath a hollowed log, lay what appeared to be a black puppy, no more than a few weeks old, its tiny body trembling with each labored breath. "Hey there, little fella," Maggie whispered, crouching despite the protest in her knees. The puppy's eyes, barely open, were a startling amber that seemed to glow against its coal-black fur. Around its neck was a raw, bloody circle where something, a collar, perhaps, had cut into its skin. Maggie hesitated, her hands hovering above the animal. Dogs had terrified her since childhood, when a neighbor's Rottweiler had pinned her against a fence, teeth bared inches from her throat. Bobby had never been able to convince her to get one, despite his love for hunting dogs. Yet something in the puppy's desperate situation pushed past her fear. "You're not going to make it out here alone," she murmured, shrugging out of her fleece jacket. Carefully, she wrapped the trembling creature, noting with alarm how thin it felt beneath the thick black fur. The puppy offered no resistance, only a soft whine that twisted something deep in Maggie's chest. The Pine Ridge Animal Hospital was closed when Maggie arrived, but she knew where Abby Thompson kept the spare key. They'd been friends too long for formalities. 20 minutes and several urgent phone calls later, Abby rushed in, still wearing her dinner party clothes. "Margaret Sullivan, since when do you rescue dogs?" Abby asked, brows raised as she examined the puppy under the bright examination lights. "Especially one that looks like this." "What does that mean?" Maggie asked, standing a safe distance away. Abby frowned, running practiced hands over the puppy's body. "This isn't some abandoned pet. Maggie, look at the skull structure, the paw size already. This is a wild animal, probably a wolf hybrid at minimum." "There aren't wolves around Pine Ridge anymore," Maggie countered. "Not officially," Abby conceded, "but trappers up north have reported sightings." She looked up, her expression grave. "I should call Wildlife Services. They have rehabilitation centers for—" "And then what happens to him?" "That depends on how wild he is." Abby's voice softened. "Maggie, you of all people, you've never even wanted a regular dog." Maggie couldn't explain the sudden protectiveness she felt. "Just patch him up. I'll figure out what to do after." 3 days became a week. A week became a month. The puppy, whom she had started calling Shadow for his tendency to follow silently at her heels, grew stronger. His amber eyes watched her with an intelligence that sometimes unsettled her. At night, he slept on the porch, refusing the bed she'd bought. By day, he explored the boundaries of her property, always returning to check on her with uncanny regularity. The first time Shadow brought her a rabbit, Maggie had been shocked. The perfect precision of the kill, the fact he hadn't eaten it himself but laid it at her feet like an offering. And when the Thompson boy had come too quickly up her drive delivering groceries, Shadow had placed himself between them, a low growl rumbling from his chest until Maggie had assured him it was okay. "That's no ordinary German shepherd," Harold Wilson had commented from the fence line, watching Shadow patrol the perimeter of Maggie's property. "Too wild in the eyes." "He's just protective," Maggie had replied, though privately. She'd begun to wonder about the strange behaviors, the howling at night that seemed to carry conversations with distant voices in the mountains, the way other dogs in town cowered when she rarely brought Shadow to the village. But he was hers now, and she was his. And for the first time since Bobby died, Maggie's house no longer echoed with emptiness. 5 years passed in the rhythm of seasons that marked life in Pine Ridge. Shadow grew from a gangly pup into a magnificent beast that stood nearly 3 feet tall at the shoulder, his black coat gleaming like polished onyx in the sunlight. Though Maggie told anyone who asked that he was a German Shepherd mix, there had always been something different about him, the way he moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost supernatural, how his amber eyes assessed strangers with an unnerving intelligence, the strange howling conversations he conducted with the wilderness on full moon nights. Pine Ridge's annual Harvest Festival arrived on a perfect autumn Saturday, the town square transformed with pumpkins, hay bales, and the smell of apple cider donuts from Miller's Bakery. Maggie rarely attended community events, but Abby had insisted, saying, "You can't hide away in that cabin forever." against her better judgment. Maggie had even brought Shadow, keeping him close on a sturdy leather leash. "That's quite the dog you've got there, ma'am," said a man Maggie didn't recognize, his camera hanging around his neck, marking him as one of the tourists who flocked to photograph the fall colors. "Mind if I take his picture?" "I suppose that would be fine," Maggie replied, tightening her grip on Shadow's leash. Shadow sat regally, as if posing, his eyes never leaving the stranger. "Remarkable specimen," the man commented, snapping several photos. "The bone structure, the eye set, the proportions. Where did you get him?" Before Maggie could answer, a local boy on a skateboard came careening around the corner, crashing directly into an elderly woman nearby. As the woman fell with a cry, Shadow lunged forward with such force that the leash burned through Maggie's glove. But instead of attacking, as several gasping onlookers clearly feared, Shadow positioned himself beside the fallen woman, allowing her to grasp his thick fur to steady herself as she rose. The photographer continued taking pictures, his expression now intense with interest. "Ma'am, I'm James Morrison from National Geographic. I specialize in North American predators, and I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but that's no German Shepherd." 3 days later, Shadow limped home with a deep gash across his flank. Maggie hadn't seen him since the previous evening, when he'd slipped out through the dog door she'd installed years ago. A door he'd long since outgrown but somehow still managed to squeeze through when the wilderness called. These overnight disappearances had become more frequent, but he'd never returned injured before. "I need to get him to Abby," Maggie muttered, trying to coax Shadow into her truck. For the first time ever, he resisted, backing away with a low whine. "Don't be stubborn. You need stitches." It took a half hour and a bribe of raw hamburger to get him into the vehicle. The entire drive. Shadow panted anxiously, his eyes fixed on the passing forest as if longing to return to it. "Doctor," Thompson's expression shifted from professional concern to something more troubled as she examined Shadow. "Maggie, this wound, it's from a trap. Someone's setting illegal traps in the forest." She hesitated, glancing at her office door to ensure it was closed. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to stay calm." Abby disappeared into her office, returning with a folder. "That photographer who was in town, he sent me this." She removed a printout of scientific analysis and a letter. He recognized Shadow immediately as a wolf, not a dog. He took hair samples from the festival grounds where Shadow was shedding. "That's ridiculous," Maggie protested. "Shadow's a German." "He's not. Maggie, I've suspected for years, but I didn't have the heart to tell you." Abby pushed the paper toward her. "This is DNA sequencing. Shadow is Canis lupus occidentalis, a Canadian timber wolf, black phase, one of the largest wolf subspecies in North America." Maggie stared at the paper, the scientific terminology swimming before her eyes. "That's not possible. He's my dog, my pet. He's a wild animal. Maggie, a protected one." Abby's voice softened. "The photographer was actually being kind. He sent this privately instead of reporting it immediately, but now that we know, we legally have to contact Fish and Wildlife Services." As if the universe had timed it perfectly. Sheriff Miller's cruiser pulled up outside the clinic, followed by an unmarked government SUV. Through the window, Maggie watched a tall man in a Department of Interior uniform step out, his face stern as he surveyed the building. "That's Agent Thomas Reynolds," Abby whispered. "Regional Endangered Species Enforcement. Someone else must have recognized Shadow at the festival." The bell above the clinic door jangled as Sheriff Miller entered, hat in hand, his expression apologetic. "Maggie, there's a federal wildlife agent here who needs to speak with you about Shadow." Agent Reynolds followed, his gaze immediately finding Shadow on the examination table. The wolf's hackles rose, a low growl rumbling in his chest despite his injury. "Mrs. Sullivan," Reynolds said, not bothering with pleasantries, "you're in possession of a protected wild animal. I'm here to inform you that keeping a timber wolf as a pet is a federal offense under the Endangered Species Act." He glanced at Shadow with professional assessment. "That animal needs to be surrendered to federal custody immediately." Maggie felt the floor tilt beneath her. 5 years of companionship, of healing, of rebuilding her life with Shadow by her side, all of it threatened by a single word, wolf. She placed her hand protectively on Shadow's back, feeling his warm fur beneath her fingers, the steady heartbeat that had kept her own heart beating through grief. "No," she said simply, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "I'm not giving him up." The Pine Ridge Public Library had never been Maggie's favorite place. Bobby had been the reader in their marriage, filling their cabin with dog-eared paperbacks and wildlife journals. But now, hunched over a computer in the back corner, Maggie found herself scrolling through page after page about wolves, their behavior, and the laws governing their protection. Shadow's wound had been treated, and she'd been allowed to take him home only after signing numerous papers acknowledging that he was now under official investigation. "You have 7 days, Mrs. Sullivan," Agent Reynolds had informed her in the parking lot of the vet clinic. 7 days to prepare for Shadow's relocation to the Wolf Conservation Center in Idaho. I'm being generous technically. I could seize him immediately. Sheriff Miller had stepped in then, vouching for Maggie, promising she wasn't a flight risk. "She's been a part of this community for decades. Agent Reynolds, give her time to process this." Now, as the library's ancient printer slowly produced articles about wolf behavior, Maggie tried to make sense of everything. According to the scientific literature, wolves weren't dogs. They couldn't be truly domesticated, only habituated to human presence. Yet Shadow had shared her home for 5 years, slept at the foot of her bed during thunderstorms, gently taken treats from her hand. The Shadow described in these clinical papers didn't match the companion who had pulled her from the depths of grief after Bobby's death. Finding anything useful, Marion Ford, the elderly librarian, appeared at Maggie's elbow with a sympathetic smile. Word traveled fast in Pine Ridge. "Not really," Maggie admitted. "Just a lot of reasons why I can't keep him." Marion glanced around before lowering her voice. "You know, my late husband worked for the Forest Service for 30 years. He always said wolves got a bad reputation from fairy tales and fearful ranchers." She slid a torn piece of paper across the desk. "This man at the university might be worth calling. He's done work on wolf-human interactions." That evening, as darkness settled over the forest, Maggie sat on her porch watching Shadow patrol the perimeter of her property. In the dying light, she could see what she'd somehow missed for years, the distinctive way he moved, more fluid than any dog, the slightly longer legs, the broader head and chest. How had she convinced herself he was just an unusual German shepherd? Had she simply seen what she wanted to see? Shadow paused in his patrol, nose lifted toward the forest as a distant howl echoed through the trees. His ears pricked forward, and for a moment, Maggie saw something wild and ancient in his posture. Then he turned to look at her, amber eyes reflecting the porch light, and trotted back to settle at her feet with a contented sigh. "What am I going to do with you?" she whispered, her fingers finding the soft spot behind his ears. The sound of tires on gravel brought them both to attention. Shadow rose, a low growl building in his chest as headlights swept across the yard. He positioned himself between Maggie and the approaching vehicle, a behavior she'd seen countless times but now recognized as deeply wolf-like, protection of the pack. Dr. Thompson's pickup came to a stop, and Shadow's posture relaxed slightly, recognizing a friend. Abby emerged carrying a folder and what looked like an old journal bound in leather. "I've been doing some digging," she announced, climbing the porch steps. "And I think there's more to this story than Agent Reynolds is acknowledging." Inside, over cups of strong coffee, Abby spread her findings across Maggie's kitchen table. "First, the area where you found Shadow 5 years ago has had no confirmed wolf packs since the 1950s. Second, black coat coloration is rare in this region but matches a specific conservation project Bobby was consulting on before he died." "Bobby never mentioned working with wolves," Maggie said, confused. "That's what I thought too. But then I remembered this." Abby pushed the leather journal forward. "Bobby gave this to Mike for safekeeping about a month before his accident. Mike forgot about it until I started asking questions today." Maggie recognized her husband's handwriting immediately, the neat block letters filling page after page with observations, coordinates, and dates. Flipping through, she found detailed notes about wolf movements, behaviors, and what appeared to be a small pack establishing territory just north of Dixon Ridge, where Bobby had fallen to his death. "I don't understand," Maggie murmured. "Why wouldn't he tell me about this?" "Keep reading," Abby urged gently. 20 minutes later, Maggie sat back. The journal opened to an entry dated just 2 weeks before Bobby's death. "Female shows signs of pregnancy. If successful, this would be the first documented reproduction of the relocated pack. Critical to keep locations secure from poachers who have been active in region." "You think Shadow came from this pack?" Maggie asked, her throat tight, "that Bobby knew about them." "It would explain a lot," Abby replied, "including why Shadow has always seemed so at home on your property." The next morning brought unwelcome visitors. Maggie was collecting eggs from her small chicken coop when a glossy black SUV with tinted windows pulled into her drive. Shadow, who had been napping on the porch, was instantly alert, his hackles rising. The man who emerged introduced himself as Elijah Carter, a wildlife conservationist interested in Shadow's case. "Word gets around in our circles," he explained with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "A pure black timber wolf living as a pet. That's quite the story." Something about Carter set Maggie on edge, perhaps the way his gaze kept returning to Shadow with an intensity that seemed less scientific and more calculating. He asked detailed questions about where she'd found Shadow, how large he'd grown, whether he ever disappeared into the forest for periods of time. "Shadow stays right here with me," Maggie lied, remembering the nights when her companion would slip away, returning with the smell of the wild on his fur. After Carter left, promising to be in touch about relocation options, Maggie noticed Shadow's agitation. He paced the house, pausing at windows to stare into the forest with unusual frequency. That night, for the first time since she'd brought him home as a puppy, Shadow refused to come inside at dusk. He remained on the porch, facing the tree line, his body tense as if expecting something or someone. Shortly after midnight, Maggie was woken by Shadow's deep, threatening growl. Grabbing Bobby's old shotgun from the closet, she moved cautiously to the front window. In the silver moonlight, she could make out a figure at the edge of her property, using what looked like a handheld device sweeping back and forth. Shadow stood rigid on the porch, his attention fixed on the intruder. Before Maggie could decide what to do, the figure retreated into the forest. Shadow remained on guard until dawn, when he finally came inside and collapsed exhausted at her feet. Later that morning, examining Shadow's old collar that had been replaced years ago, Maggie found something that made her blood run cold, a tiny device no bigger than a button, tucked into the leather, a tracking device, but placed by whom and when? Sheriff Miller's reaction was immediate concern when Maggie showed him the device. "This isn't standard wildlife tracking technology," he explained, turning it over in his weathered hands. "This is more sophisticated, the kind used in private security or less legal operations." "Like poaching?" Maggie asked. thinking of Bobby's journal and its warnings. Frank nodded grimly. There's been an increase in wolf poaching over the last few years. A black timber wolf pelt can fetch upwards of $20,000 on the black market in Asia. More if they can get certain parts that are used in traditional medicines. The implications settled heavily between them. You think this Carter fellow? I can't make accusations without evidence, Frank cautioned. But I've put in a call to the State Wildlife Division to verify his credentials. In the meantime, Maggie, you need to be careful. If Shadow is as rare as everyone seems to think, there are people who would see him as a payday, not a protected animal. As the week progressed, Maggie noticed unfamiliar vehicles passing slowly by her property. Twice, she found evidence that someone had been walking the perimeter of her land. Cigarette butts of a brand nobody in Pine Ridge smoked, a distinctive boot print in the mud near her back fence. Shadow grew increasingly restless, spending more time watching the forest, his body language communicating tension Maggie had never seen before. 4 days after Agent Reynolds' ultimatum, Shadow disappeared. Maggie woke to find the dog door pushed completely off its hinges, bent outward as if Shadow had forced his way through in desperate haste. Panicked, she spent the day calling for him, hiking the trails behind her property until her voice was hoarse and her legs ached. He returned at dusk, limping slightly, with what looked like blood not his own darkening his muzzle. His amber eyes held something Maggie couldn't interpret, a wildness more pronounced than ever before. When she tried to check him for injuries, he gently but firmly stepped away, positioning himself at the window facing the forest. That night, Maggie couldn't sleep. She sat at Bobby's old desk, reading through his journal again, looking for anything she might have missed. Around 2 a.m, she found a sketch of what appeared to be an abandoned firewatch tower deep in the national forest, with coordinates carefully noted. Bobby's last entry mentioned checking the area for denning possibilities for the pregnant wolf. "Is that where you go?" she whispered to Shadow, who had finally settled on the rug beside her chair. "Is that where your family is?" The next day, Dr. Thompson arrived with news that confirmed Maggie's growing suspicions. "Elijah Carter isn't who he claims to be," Abby reported, her expression grave. "The conservation group he named has never heard of him, and there have been reports of unusual hunting activity in the National Forest, people with specialized equipment, active at night." "Poachers," Maggie said flatly. Abby nodded. "And there's more. Mike remembered something about Bobby's accident that never sat right with him. The injuries weren't consistent with a simple fall. There were bruises on his arms that looked like defensive wounds. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Bobby had discovered a wolf pack, protected them, tracked their reproduction, and possibly died because of what he knew. Now, 5 years later, the poachers were back, and they had located Shadow. With only 2 days remaining before Agent Reynolds would return to take Shadow, Maggie made her decision. She would find the watchtower Bobby had documented, see for herself what Shadow had been protecting during his nighttime disappearances. If there was any chance of understanding the full truth, it lay in following Bobby's final footsteps. "I can't lose him too," she told Abby, who had argued against her plan to hike deep into the forest alone. "Shadow isn't just a pet, and he isn't just a wolf. He's my last connection to Bobby, to the work he was doing. There's something more happening here, that's all, and I'm going to find out what it is." That evening, as Maggie packed a small backpack with essentials for an overnight hike, Shadow watched her with those intelligent amber eyes. For the first time in their years together, Maggie felt like they truly understood each other, not as owner and pet, but as allies preparing to face a common threat. "You ready to show me your other home?" she asked softly. Shadow's tail swished once, decisively, and he moved to the door. Dawn had barely broken when Maggie and Shadow set out. tendrils of mist still clinging to the forest floor. The air held the sharp promise of approaching winter, each breath visible in small clouds that dissipated among the pines. Maggie had left a note for Abby detailing her plans and the coordinates from Bobby's journal, just in case. She carried Bobby's old hunting rifle slung across her back not for hunting, but for protection. Against what? She wasn't entirely sure. Shadow led the way, no longer the companion who matched his pace to hers, but a purposeful guide, picking a path through the underbrush with confident familiarity. Occasionally he would pause, looking back as if to ensure she was keeping up, his amber eyes reflecting an almost human concern. They traveled steadily upward, the gentle slopes of Maggie's property giving way to the steeper terrain of national forest land. By midday they had covered nearly 7 miles, far faster than Maggie would have managed alone. Her joints protested, but determination kept her moving. The forest had changed character, the well-traveled hiking paths replaced by game trails, and then, eventually, by what seemed to be no trail at all yet, Shadow moved forward without hesitation. "You really do know where you're going, don't you?" Maggie murmured as they paused by a small stream. Shadow's ears twitched at her voice, but his attention remained divided, constantly scanning their surroundings with the hypervigilance of a wild predator. It was during this brief rest that Maggie first noticed they were being followed. Nothing obvious, just the faintest crack of a branch, quickly silenced, from the direction they had come. Shadow had heard it too. His head snapped toward the sound, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "We need to move," Maggie whispered, gathering her pack. The peaceful mission of discovery had suddenly acquired an edge of danger. They altered course, Shadow leading them through a nearly impenetrable thicket of young pines that tore at Maggie's clothing but provided cover. The detour cost them time and daylight. As afternoon shadows lengthened into the purple hues of approaching evening, Maggie felt the first drops of rain, the storm that had been forecast for the following day, arriving early. "Perfect timing," she muttered, pulling a rain jacket from her pack. Shadow seemed unfazed by the weather, continuing his steady pace through the increasingly dense forest. It was Shadow who alerted her to the second threat. Without warning, he froze in place, his body rigid, eyes fixed on something ahead. Following his gaze, Maggie spotted the glint of metal through the trees, a game camera mounted high on a pine trunk, its lens oriented toward the path ahead. Not a Forest Service camera, which would have been clearly marked, but something deliberately camouflaged. "Someone's watching these trails," she said softly, her suspicion growing. Shadow led her in a wide arc around the camera's field of view, adding precious time to their journey as the storm intensified. By the time they reached the base of the ridge where Bobby's coordinates indicated the fire tower should be, darkness had nearly fallen, and the rain had become a steady, cold downpour. Maggie's legs trembled with fatigue, her breath coming in labored gasps as they climbed the final steep incline. At 60, despite her regular hiking, this expedition pushed the limits of her endurance. Shadow, sensing her struggle, stayed closer now, occasionally pressing his substantial body against her legs when she faltered on the slippery ground. The gesture felt deliberately supportive, another indication of an intelligence that went beyond what any dog or perhaps even what most wolves would display. The fire tower emerged from the mist like a specter, its weathered structure silhouetted against the darkening sky. Long abandoned by the Forest Service, its metal framework had begun to rust, and several steps on the access stairway had rotted through. Yet there were signs of recent human presence, fresh boot prints in the mud, a coil of high-tensile wire partially hidden under a tarp, the unmistakable metallic scent of gun oil. "Someone's been using this place," Maggie whispered to Shadow, who had grown increasingly tense as they approached. "Recently." Before she could investigate further, Shadow's demeanor changed dramatically. His ears flattened against his skull, and a warning growl vibrated through his body. He positioned himself in front of Maggie, facing back the way they had come. Seconds later, the beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the rain and mist, followed by a man's voice. "Mrs. Sullivan, is that you out there?" The voice belonged to Agent Reynolds. "We need to talk." Maggie hesitated, instinctively ducking behind the tower's base. Shadow remained perfectly still, water streaming from his black coat, eyes fixed on the approaching light. "I know you're up here," Reynolds continued, closer now. "Your friend Dr. Thompson showed me your note. You need to come out, it's not safe." Something in his tone made Maggie distrust the apparent concern. She'd left the note for Abby, not for a federal agent who had been ready to take Shadow away. How had he gotten it? And how had he reached the tower so quickly? In this weather. Unless he'd already been in the area. "Mrs. Sullivan," Reynolds called again, his flashlight beam sweeping the clearing. "There are armed poachers in these woods. I'm trying to help you." Shadow's growl deepened as a second beam of light appeared from a different direction. Maggie's hand moved to the rifle slung across her back, indecision freezing her in place. Could she trust Reynolds? Was he truly here to help? Or was this somehow connected to the cameras, the tracking device, the strange visitors to her property? The decision was made for her when a third light appeared, forming a triangle that was slowly closing in on the tower. Shadow backed up, pressing against Maggie's legs, urging her toward the tower stairs. "Mrs. Sullivan," Reynolds' voice had lost its diplomatic tone. "Federal agent, come out now with your hands visible." In that moment, with rain soaking through her clothes and darkness nearly complete, Maggie made her choice. She trusted Shadow. Gripping the rusted railing, she began to climb the tower stairs, the wolf following so closely that she could feel his breath on her calves. The first gunshot shattered the night just as they reached the observation platform 30 feet above the ground. Maggie dropped instinctively to the metal grating, pulling Shadow down beside her as splinters flew from the wooden railing. Not a warning shot, someone was shooting to kill. "She's up in the tower," a voice shouted. Not Reynolds now, but someone else. "Don't let them get away. Trapped and exposed." Maggie's mind raced. The platform offered no real protection, just elevation and visibility. In the near-total darkness, with only the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the scene below, she could make out 3 figures converging on the tower base. "We know what you have, Mrs. Sullivan," called a voice she recognized as Elijah Carter's. "Your pet wolf isn't just any wolf. He's the alpha of the only pure black pack in North America worth a fortune to the right buyers." Shadow's body vibrated with tension beside her, his eyes fixed on the men below. In a flash of lightning, Maggie saw that one of them, presumably Carter, carried what looked like a tranquilizer gun, while the others held rifles. "We've been tracking this pack for years," Carter continued, his voice carrying clearly through the rain. "Ever since your husband interfered with our operation. Do you know how much a breeding pair of black wolves is worth overseas? Millions, and you've been keeping the alpha male as a pet." The revelation struck Maggie like a physical blow. Bobby hadn't fallen. He'd been killed because he'd discovered poachers targeting a rare wolf pack, Shadow's pack. And now, 5 years later, they had returned to finish what they'd started. "Just send the wolf down, Mrs. Sullivan," Carter called, his tone reasonable, as if discussing a business transaction. "You're harboring an endangered animal illegally anyway. No one needs to get hurt." Another shot rang out, this one splintering a support beam near Maggie's head. Not aiming to kill her, she realized just forcing her into compliance. Shadow's behavior changed suddenly. He rose from his protective crouch beside Maggie and moved to the edge of the platform. his attention no longer on the men below, but fixed on the dark forest beyond. A low, distinctive howl rose from his throat, not the random howling she'd heard over the years, but something deliberate, a communication. To Maggie's astonishment, an answering howl echoed from the forest, then another, and another. Shadow had called for reinforcements. "They're coming," one of the men shouted, panic evident in his voice. "The whole damn pack is coming." The night erupted into chaos. Dark shapes emerged from the forest wolves, at least 5 of them, their eyes reflecting the flashlight beams as they circled the clearing. Unlike Shadow, these wolves moved with the coordinated precision of animals that had never known human care, spreading out to surround the hunters. "Shoot them!" Carter screamed, his businesslike demeanor evaporating. "Take them all down!" Gunfire erupted below, muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the scene. One wolf yelped in pain, but the others pressed forward, their attack focused and strategic. Shadow turned to Maggie, nudging her insistently toward the stairs. "You want me to go down there?" she asked incredulously. "Into that—" Shadow's amber eyes held hers, and in that moment, Maggie understood. He wasn't leading her into danger, but away from it. While the pack engaged the hunters, creating a diversion, they had a chance to escape, with no better option. Maggie began the treacherous descent, the metal stairs slick with rain. Shadow followed, his body tense and alert. When they reached the ground, the scene was one of controlled chaos. The wolves had drawn the hunters away from the tower, separating them from each other in the darkness. Shadow guided Maggie to the edge of the clearing opposite from where they had arrived, his body always between her and the ongoing conflict. They had almost reached the shelter of the trees when a shout froze them in place. "Stop right there." Agent Reynolds emerged from the shadows, his service weapon trained on them. Blood streaked one side of his face from a gash at his temple. "Mrs. Sullivan, step away from the wolf." Maggie raised her hands slowly, her heart hammering. "Those men are poachers. They killed my husband." "I know exactly who they are," Reynolds replied, his expression grim. "I've been investigating this trafficking ring for 2 years. Your husband's case file crossed my desk 6 months ago when we connected it to an international wildlife smuggling operation." A howl of pain cut through the night one of Shadow's pack members. Injured or worse. Shadow's muscles bunched, his attention torn between Maggie's safety and the call of his wild family. "Go," Maggie whispered to him. "Help them." Shadow hesitated, whining softly. "I said go," Maggie insisted, giving him a gentle push. "I'll be okay." With one last look that seemed to contain a lifetime of communication, Shadow melted into the darkness toward the sounds of conflict. Maggie turned back to Reynolds, who had lowered his weapon slightly. "You really do have a connection with that animal," he said, something like wonder in his voice. "I've never seen anything like it." "He saved my life after Bobby died," Maggie said simply. "And now I think he's trying to save his other family, too." A scream of terror erupted from near the tower, Carter's voice, filled with primal fear. Then a gunshot, followed by eerie silence. "We need to move," Reynolds said urgently, holstering his weapon and grasping Maggie's arm. "My backup is still 20 minutes out. Those poachers are desperate, and they're well armed." They had barely taken 3 steps when the crack of a rifle shot echoed through the clearing. Maggie felt the impact before she registered the sound, a burning, tearing sensation in her left shoulder that spun her around and dropped her to her knees in the mud. "Damn it." Reynolds dragged her behind a fallen log as another shot splintered bark near their heads. "Mrs. Sullivan, stay with me. The bullet went through clean." Maggie pressed her hand to her shoulder, warm blood seeping between her fingers. The pain was distant somehow, secondary to the cold and the overwhelming need to know what had happened to Shadow. Through the haze of shock, she heard Carter's voice again, closer now. I know you're out there. Agent Reynolds, throw out your weapon and stand up, or the next shot goes through the old lady's head." Reynolds swore softly, checking his ammunition. "I can't get a clear shot from here." "Shadow," Maggie whispered, her voice weak from pain and blood loss. "He'll come back." "Mrs. Sullivan, with all due respect, we can't bet our lives on a wild animal choosing—" A blood-chilling snarl cut through the night, followed by Carter's scream of terror and pain. The massive black shape of Shadow launched from the darkness, taking the poacher down in a fury of snapping teeth and overwhelming power. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the air as man and wolf crashed to the ground in a violent struggle. Reynolds seized the opportunity, breaking cover to disarm the second poacher who had been providing backup for Carter. In the chaos, Maggie struggled to her feet, the world spinning around her as blood loss took its toll. She staggered toward where Shadow and Carter were locked in combat. The man's screams turned to gurgling pleas. "Shadow, stop!" she commanded, her voice finding strength from somewhere deep within. "That's enough." To Reynolds' visible amazement, the wolf immediately released his grip on Carter's arm, backing away to stand protectively beside Maggie as she swayed on her feet. The poacher lay moaning in the mud, his arm mangled but his life intact. "I'll be damned," Reynolds muttered, securing the second poacher with zip ties. "He actually listened to you." Maggie didn't respond. Her vision was tunneling, darkness encroaching from the edges as the adrenaline ebbed and the reality of her injury took hold. As she felt herself falling, the last thing she saw was Shadow's amber eyes watching her with what could only be described as human concern. Maggie floated through layers of consciousness, aware first of antiseptic smells, then beeping monitors, and finally hushed voices discussing her condition. Her shoulder throbbed with dull, medicated pain. When she finally managed to open her eyes, she found herself in a hospital room, the pale morning light filtering through vinyl blinds. Dr. Mike Thompson stood at the foot of her bed, reviewing a chart. "Welcome back," he said, noticing her stirring. "You gave us quite a scare. Maggie." "Shadow," she whispered, her throat dry and voice raspy. "Where's Shadow?" Mike's expression tightened. "Let's focus on you first. The bullet went through your shoulder cleanly, but you lost a significant amount of blood. You're stable now, but you'll need time to recover." "Mike." Maggie struggled to sit up, wincing as pain shot through her shoulder. "Where is he?" With a sigh, Mike pulled a chair beside her bed. "Agent Reynolds brought you down from the mountain. Search and rescue couldn't get up there in the storm, but he managed to stop the bleeding and carry you halfway before they met him. You've been unconscious for nearly 24 hours. That's not what I asked." "I know." Mike looked down at his hands. "Shadow remained in the forest with the other wolves when they transported you. But Abby says Agent Reynolds has filed his report, and since Shadow is confirmed to be a pure Canadian timber wolf, he's legally classified as an endangered species that cannot be kept as a pet. Fish and Wildlife has issued a capture order." The news hit Maggie like a second bullet. "They can't take him. He saved my life. He saved Agent Reynolds' life." "I know, Maggie. Everyone knows. The whole town is talking about it." Mike squeezed her hand gently. "But the law is clear. Even with the poachers arrested, Shadow is still a wild animal under federal protection." Over the next 2 days, as Maggie regained strength in the small Pine Ridge Community Hospital, the full story emerged through visitors. Sheriff Miller described how they had arrested the third poacher attempting to flee in a truck loaded with specialized hunting equipment and what appeared to be preparations for transporting live animals. Agent Reynolds, making an awkward but sincere visit, confirmed that Elijah Carter was part of an international wildlife trafficking ring specializing in rare predator species. "We've been tracking them for years," Reynolds explained, standing stiffly by her window. "Your husband's death was originally ruled accidental, but when we connected it to similar incidents involving wildlife researchers, we reopened the case. I was actually here investigating Bobby's death when reports of a possible wolf living as a pet came in." "So you were never really here for Shadow," Maggie said. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "Initially, I was... Endangered species laws are clear, but after what happened on that mountain..." He paused, seemingly struggling with his words. "Mrs. Sullivan, what I witnessed between you and that wolf defies everything I know about wildlife behavior. He protected you. He responded to your commands in the middle of an attack. That's unprecedented. So help me keep him," Maggie pleaded. "It's not that simple." Reynolds moved to the door. "I've submitted my full report, including Shadow's actions. But my superiors have made their decision. When you're released, I'm under orders to serve you with official notice that Shadow is to be tranquilized and relocated to the Wolf Conservation Center in Idaho within 72 hours. Reynolds' words left a cold emptiness in Maggie's chest that even the pain medication couldn't numb. Shadow had disappeared into the forest with his wild pack, but she knew with a certainty that transcended logic that he would return to her. And when he did, the government would be waiting to take him away. On the third day, Abby helped Maggie check out of the hospital against medical advice. "You should stay another day at least," she fussed, supporting Maggie as they walked slowly to her truck. "I need to be home when Shadow comes back," Maggie replied, her voice leaving no room for argument. The cabin felt empty and cold when they arrived. While Abby prepared tea in the kitchen, Maggie moved slowly through the rooms, touching Shadow's worn bed, the rope toys he'd never shown much interest in, the special brush she'd used on his thick coat. 5 years of shared life, of healing together, represented in these ordinary objects. By evening, a light snow had begun to fall, the first of the season. Maggie sat on her porch, wrapped in blankets despite Abby's protests about the cold, her eyes fixed on the tree line. The pain in her shoulder was nothing compared to the ache in her heart. "He'll come back," she told Abby, who had finally given up trying to convince her to come inside. "He always comes back." "And then what?" "Maggie," Abby asked gently, "Reynolds has a team on standby. They'll tranquilize him and take him away. Maybe it's better if he stays wild now, with his pack." "You don't understand," Maggie insisted. "Shadow isn't just mine, and he isn't just theirs. He's both. He chose both." As darkness fell, Abby reluctantly departed, extracting a promise from Maggie to come inside before midnight. "You can't help him if you get pneumonia," she chided. Alone now, Maggie watched the snow accumulate on the porch railing, the silence of the winter night broken only by the occasional call of an owl. Memories of Shadow flooded her mind, the tiny wounded puppy she'd found, his first cautious explorations of the cabin, the way he'd always positioned himself between her and strangers, his gentle acceptance of her grief over Bobby. Near midnight, as Maggie was finally conceding that perhaps she should honor her promise to Abby, a familiar silhouette emerged from the trees. Shadow padded slowly across the snowy yard, his black coat dusted with white, his amber eyes reflecting the porch light. Behind him, at the edge of the forest, other shapes lingered, the wolves from the mountain, his wild family. "Shadow," Maggie whispered, her voice catching. He approached the porch steps and sat, looking up at her with that uncanny intelligence, no longer trying to hide his true nature. He carried himself with the dignity of what he truly was, an alpha wolf who had somehow formed a bond with a human that defied natural order. Maggie descended the steps carefully, mindful of her injured shoulder, and knelt in the snow before him. Shadow allowed her to wrap her good arm around his massive neck, his warm breath against her cheek as familiar as her own reflection. "They're going to take you away," She murmured into his fur. Fish and wildlife. They say you belong in a conservation center, or in the wild. Not with me. Shadow pulled back slightly, his amber eyes meeting hers in the dim light. For a moment, Maggie could almost believe he understood every word. Then he turned, looking back at the wolves waiting at the forest edge, before returning his gaze to her. "Is that your family?" Maggie asked, following his gaze. "Are they waiting for you?" As if in answer, one of the wolves, slightly smaller, with a subtle silver marking on its chest, stepped forward, venturing a few cautious feet into the clearing. Shadow responded with a soft whine, somehow communicating across the distance. The female wolf for Maggie was certain now that it was female, hesitated, then retreated back to the safety of the trees. "You're caught between two worlds," Maggie realized aloud. "Just like I've been since Bobby died. Not fully here, not fully there." The parallel struck her with sudden clarity. For 5 years, she had existed in limbo, living in Pine Ridge but isolated from its community, surrounded by Bobby's things but unable to move forward. Shadow had been her bridge, the one connection that made her half-life bearable. And perhaps, in some way, she couldn't fully understand. She had been his bridge, too, between the domestic and the wild, between solitude and connection. The sound of a vehicle approaching broke the moment. Headlights swept across the property as a fish and wildlife truck pulled into her drive, followed by Sheriff Miller's cruiser. Agent Reynolds emerged from the first vehicle, tranquilizer rifle in hand, his expression solemn as he spotted Shadow in the yard. "Mrs. Sullivan," he called, his voice carrying in the still night air. "Please step away from the wolf." Shadow growled low in his throat, the sound vibrating through Maggie's hand still resting on his back. The wolves at the forest edge had vanished at the first sound of engines, melting into the darkness as only wild creatures can. "Give me a minute," Maggie called back, her voice breaking. "Please." Reynolds hesitated, then nodded, lowering his rifle slightly. Maggie turned back to Shadow, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "I don't know if you understand, but they're going to take you somewhere far away, a place where they think you'll be safe." She buried her face in his thick fur one last time. "I'm so sorry. I couldn't protect you." Shadow remained unnaturally still, his amber eyes fixed on her face. Then, with deliberate gentleness, he pulled away from her embrace and backed several steps toward the forest, stopping halfway between Maggie and the trees where his wild family had disappeared. The message was unmistakable, even to the humans watching the scene unfold. Shadow wouldn't be captured tonight. He wouldn't be relocated to any conservation center. He had made his choice. "Mrs. Sullivan," Reynolds said quietly, approaching through the snow, "you need to come inside now." "Your friend Dr. Thompson called. She's worried about your health." "He's leaving," Maggie whispered, still kneeling in the snow. "He's choosing freedom." As Reynolds helped her to her feet, Shadow turned and loped toward the forest, his powerful stride carrying him swiftly into the darkness. At the tree line, he paused for one last look back, his silhouette visible for just a moment before he vanished completely. The emptiness that filled Maggie then was beyond tears, beyond words, a void so complete it seemed to hollow out her very being. Shadow was gone, this time perhaps forever, taking with him the last warmth in her frozen life. 3 days after Shadow disappeared into the forest, Maggie found herself sitting in Sheriff Miller's office, staring blankly at the search warrant Agent Reynolds had reluctantly served. The federal agents had spent hours combing through her cabin, taking photographs, bagging items related to Shadow, and most puzzlingly removing several boxes of Bobby's old papers from the storage shed behind the house. "They're just following procedure," Frank explained, sliding a cup of coffee across his desk toward her. With Carter and his associates facing federal charges for wildlife trafficking and potentially for Bobby's death, they need to document everything. Maggie nodded absently, her fingers tracing the rim of the mug. In the days since Shadow's departure, she had moved through life like a ghost, her physical pain from the gunshot wound nothing compared to the hollow ache of loss. The cabin, once filled with Shadow's quiet presence, now echoed with emptiness. They found something in Bobby's papers. Frank continued carefully. Something Reynolds thinks you should see. That got her attention. What do you mean? They've been going through everything, trying to build their case against Carter. Apparently, Bobby kept meticulous records. Frank hesitated. Reynolds asked if you'd be willing to come down to the ranger station tomorrow morning. There's information about Bobby's work that they want to share with you. The Pine Ridge Ranger Station sat at the edge of town, a modest building of timber and stone that served as the local headquarters for forest management. When Maggie arrived the next morning, she found not only Agent Reynolds waiting, but also a woman she didn't recognize, a scholarly-looking person in her 40s with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Mrs. Sullivan, thank you for coming. Reynolds greeted her, more warmly than any of their previous interactions. This is Dr. Eleanor Chambers from the North American Wolf Conservation Project. She's been reviewing your husband's research notes. Dr. Chambers extended her hand. Mrs. Sullivan, I can't tell you what an honor it is to meet you. Your husband's work was groundbreaking, though we didn't realize its full extent until now. Confused, Maggie allowed herself to be led into a conference room where Bobby's papers, journals, and what appeared to be external hard drives were spread across a large table. A laptop displayed photographs of wolves, black wolves, in various natural settings. Please, sit, Dr. Chambers urged, pulling out a chair. What I'm about to show you may be difficult, but I believe it will help you understand Shadow and the extraordinary bond you shared with him. Over the next hour, Dr. Chambers methodically laid out the truth that had been hidden in Bobby's research. 6 years ago, he had been contracted by the Wolf Conservation Project to monitor a highly classified reintroduction of Canadian black wolves into a remote section of the Northern Cascades. Unlike other wolf reintroduction programs that were publicly announced, this one had been kept secret due to the rare genetic makeup of the wolves involved. The black coat in wolves comes from a specific genetic marker that was introduced to wolf populations through ancient hybridization with domestic dogs thousands of years ago. Dr. Chambers explained, showing Maggie a genetic chart. These particular wolves carried an extremely rare variant that makes them unique. Unique how? Maggie asked, struggling to process the information. Dr. Chambers hesitated, glancing at Reynolds. They demonstrate unusual cognitive abilities and social behaviors, even for wolves, heightened problem-solving, advanced communication patterns, and most significantly, an unprecedented capacity to form bonds across species lines. You're saying they're smarter than normal wolves? Maggie's voice held a hint of defensive anger. That this somehow explained Shadow. I'm saying your husband recognized something extraordinary in this pack. Dr. Chambers replied gently. Something worth protecting at all costs. According to his notes, he'd been observing them for nearly a year before the accident. Reynolds stepped forward, opening a folder. Mrs. Sullivan, we now have evidence that your husband's death wasn't an accident, based on Bobby's final journal entries and forensic re-examination of the scene. We believe he confronted Carter and his associates when he caught them setting traps near the wolves' denning area. Maggie's hands trembled as she accepted the folder. Inside was a printed copy of Bobby's last journal entry, dated the day before his death. Observed poachers again today near the North Ridge. Same equipment as before, specialized traps, tranquilizer guns. They're professionals, likely with international connections. Called Frank to report suspicious activity without specifics. Can't risk exposing the pack's location even to authorities until the conservation order comes through next month. Alpha female is very near-term, pups expected within days. If poachers find the den now, the entire project is at risk. Beneath it was a sticky note in Bobby's handwriting. Meeting with unknown contact tomorrow. Claims to have information about poachers. Ridge Trail, 10 a.m. The implications crashed over Maggie in waves. Bobby hadn't fallen during a routine hike. He'd been murdered, lured to a remote location by someone connected to the poaching operation, likely Carter himself. "We found this in a hidden compartment in Bobby's desk," Reynolds said quietly, placing a sealed plastic evidence bag on the table. Inside was a small USB drive. It contains video footage from trail cameras Bobby had positioned around the wolf territory. Dr. Chambers connected the drive to her laptop and pulled up a video file. The timestamp showed a date just 2 days before Bobby's death. The nighttime footage, captured in the eerie green glow of infrared, showed a clearing with what appeared to be a den entrance. A large, black wolf, the alpha female, emerged, heavily pregnant. Behind her, another black wolf followed, unmistakably a younger version of Shadow. Bobby named him Midnight in his notes, Dr. Chambers explained. The alpha female's first offspring from her previous litter, just reaching maturity. According to Bobby's observations, he showed unusual curiosity about humans, even approaching Bobby's observation blind on several occasions. The video continued, showing the pregnant wolf settling outside the den entrance while the younger wolf Shadow patrolled the perimeter. Suddenly, both wolves became alert, staring into the forest. Bobby's voice, whispered and tense, came through the camera's microphone. "Someone's out there. They shouldn't be here at night." The footage showed Shadow advancing toward whatever had disturbed them, disappearing from frame. Seconds later, a gunshot echoed through the forest, and the pregnant wolf bolted back into the den. The video ended abruptly. "We believe this was the night Shadow was injured," Reynolds explained. "From examining the subsequent footage and Bobby's notes, it appears the poachers wounded him while attempting to access the den. He disappeared for several days." Bobby noted his concern. Dr. Chambers queued up another video, dated 3 days later. This one showed Bobby himself, speaking directly to the camera in what appeared to be his home office, the same room in Maggie's cabin that she'd maintained exactly as he'd left it. "If you're watching this, Maggie, something's happened to me," Bobby began, his familiar face causing Maggie's breath to catch. "I've encountered something incredible out here, a wolf pack with abilities we've barely begun to understand. But there are people who want to capture them, sell them for profit. They've been tracking the alpha female, who's about to give birth. I can't let that happen." He paused, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so achingly familiar that Maggie had to look away. "Tomorrow I'm meeting someone who claims to have information about the poachers. It could be a trap, which is why I'm recording this. If I don't return, there's a wolf out there, a young male I call Midnight. He's been injured, probably by the same people I'm investigating. If he survives, he'll be the key to understanding these animals. Find him, Maggie. Protect him. He's more important than anyone realizes." The video ended, leaving the room in silence broken only by Maggie's ragged breathing. All these years, she'd believed finding Shadow had been coincidence, a random act of kindness that had pulled her from grief. Now she understood it had been Bobby's final request, fulfilled without her even knowing. "Shadow found me," she whispered, "because Bobby sent him." Dr. Chambers leaned forward. "We don't know that for certain, but what we do know is remarkable enough. You found an injured wolf that Bobby had been observing. You raised him during his formative period, and most incredibly, he maintained connection with both you and his wild pack, serving as a bridge between worlds." Reynolds cleared his throat. Mrs. Sullivan, I need to be transparent with you. When I arrived in Pine Ridge, my orders were to locate and remove a potentially dangerous wild animal being kept illegally. What I've discovered since then, Bobby's research, Shadow's behavior, the connection to an international poaching ring has changed everything. Including what happens to Shadow if he returns, Maggie asked, a fragile hope rising. Dr. Chambers and Reynolds exchanged glances. That's why we wanted to show you all this, Dr. Chambers said. With Bobby's research and the circumstances now documented, we've petitioned the Department of Interior for a special designation for your property. If approved, it would be classified as a satellite research area for the Wolf Conservation Project, with you as a designated monitor. What does that mean in plain English? Maggie demanded. Reynolds allowed himself a small smile. It means that if Shadow chooses to return to your property, he would be legally permitted to do so. As would any of his pack members, your land would become part of a protected corridor connecting to the existing conservation area. For the first time in days, Maggie felt something other than emptiness. Not quite joy, the wound was still too fresh for that, but perhaps the distant cousin of hope. But there's more. Dr. Chambers continued, her expression growing more animated. Bobby's research contains references to previous observations notes, photographs, data spanning nearly a decade before the official reintroduction program. He'd been tracking remnant wolf populations in these mountains for years, documenting behaviors that challenged everything we thought we knew about wolf-human dynamics. She pulled out a faded photograph showing a much younger Bobby kneeling beside what appeared to be a black wolf, his hand resting comfortably on its back. The wolf showed none of the fear or aggression a wild predator should display toward a human. This was taken 15 years ago, Dr. Chambers explained. Bobby never published these findings formally, but he detailed a theory about certain wolf bloodlines retaining genetic memory of earlier, more collaborative relationships with humans dating back to the earliest domestication events. Are you saying Shadow's ancestors were domesticated? Maggie asked, struggling to understand. Not exactly. More like they descended from wolf populations that developed cooperative relationships with humans thousands of years ago. Before modern dog breeds existed, these genetic traits have been preserved in isolation in certain remote wolf populations. Reynolds looked uncomfortable with this line of discussion. What matters from a legal standpoint is that Bobby's documented research provides scientific justification for a special permit situation. It transforms what appeared to be an illegal pet ownership into a legitimate conservation research scenario. As Maggie left the ranger station hours later, her mind reeled with information. Bobby hadn't just died in an accident. He'd been killed protecting the wolves he studied. Shadow wasn't just any wolf, but part of a unique bloodline Bobby had dedicated years to understanding. And most incredibly, her random act of kindness in rescuing an injured puppy had unknowingly fulfilled her husband's final wish. She drove home slowly, the winter landscape a blur beyond her windshield. When she pulled into her driveway, she was surprised to see Abby's truck already there, along with several other vehicles she recognized from town. Sarah Jenkins from the diner, Harold Wilson and his wife, even Mike Thompson's car. Abby met her at the door, practically vibrating with excitement. Did you hear what they found in Bobby's research? The whole town's talking about it. Inside, Maggie found her usually empty living room filled with neighbors, all speaking in animated voices that fell silent when she entered. "We're here to help," Maggie, Harold said, stepping forward. "If they're going to turn your place into some kind of wolf sanctuary, you'll need proper fencing, feeding stations, observation points." "And we figured Bobby would want us to pitch in," Sarah added. Her usual taciturn expression softened with determination. Maggie looked around the room, stunned. These were the same people who had kept a polite distance for years, respecting her grief by leaving her alone. Now they were offering help, rallying around the vision Bobby had left behind. "I don't even know if Shadow will come back," she admitted, her voice catching. "He'll come back," Abby declared with certainty. "That wolf didn't survive 5 years with you and another 5 years of poachers just to disappear now. Bobby knew what he was doing when he studied that pack, and he knew what he was doing when he made sure you'd find Shadow." Later that evening, after everyone had gone, Maggie sat on her porch despite the cold, a habit she couldn't break. The forest beyond her property line was silent, the snow-covered ground empty of tracks. But something had changed inside her, the hollow ache replaced by a sense of purpose that felt both new and familiar. Bobby hadn't just been a wildlife biologist, he'd been a visionary who recognized something remarkable in these wolves, and Maggie hadn't just been grieving, she'd been unconsciously continuing his work, forming a bond with Shadow that defied conventional understanding. For the first time since she'd watched Shadow disappear into the trees, Maggie allowed herself to believe he might return not as a pet reclaiming a comfortable life, but as something more complex and meaningful. A bridge between worlds, just as Bobby had been. As darkness settled over the mountains, Maggie whispered into the night, "I understand now. Bobby, I understand what you were trying to do." And somewhere in the distant forest, as if in answer, a wolf howled. Spring came slowly to the mountains of Montana, winter reluctantly releasing its grip in fits and starts. The snow retreated first from Maggie's property, where southern exposure and daily attention had created a hospitable environment ahead of the surrounding forest. 6 months had passed since Shadow had disappeared into the wilderness with his wild family, 6 months of transformation for both the land and its owner. Maggie stood on the newly constructed observation deck that extended from what had once been Bobby's home office, surveying the changes. Low, wildlife-friendly fencing now marked the boundaries of what the Department of Interior had officially designated as the Sullivan Wolf Corridor Research Station. The unwieldy name had quickly been shortened by locals to Sullivan Sanctuary, a term Maggie found both amusing and oddly fitting. "Looking for him again?" Abby asked, joining her with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. Maggie accepted the offered drink with a smile. "Just enjoying the view. The lupine is starting to bloom early this year." Both women knew it was a partial truth. Every morning and evening since Shadow's departure, Maggie had kept vigil, watching the tree line for any sign of the wolf who had changed her life. There had been tracks, occasionally large paw prints in fresh snow or mud, that experts had confirmed belonged to wolves, but no sightings of Shadow himself. "The university team arrives tomorrow," Abby reminded her, leaning against the railing. "Are you ready for them?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Maggie replied. The research partnership with the North American Wolf Conservation Project had been finalized in February, bringing with it funding, equipment, and legitimacy. Graduate students would be conducting non-invasive observations throughout the spring and summer, using the cabin as their base of operations. Maggie's role had evolved from reluctant participant to essential team member as Dr. Chambers recognized her unique perspective and knowledge. The journals Maggie had kept during her years with Shadow had proven invaluable, documenting behaviors that challenged conventional understanding of wolf capabilities. Her observations of Shadow's problem-solving, communication attempts, and social bonding had filled gaps in Bobby's more scientific notes. "I never thought I'd be hosting a bunch of wildlife biology students at my age," Maggie mused, watching a pair of bluebirds investigate one of the many nest boxes that now dotted her property. "Bobby would be so proud," Abby said softly, "not just of the research, but of you, the way you've opened up, become part of the community again." It was true. The shared purpose of transforming Maggie's property into a wildlife corridor had brought her back into the fabric of Pine Ridge in ways she hadn't experienced since before Bobby's death. Harold Wilson, once suspicious of Shadow, had become her most dedicated volunteer, helping design and build the observation structures. Sarah Jenkins organized a rotating meal schedule among town residents to feed the research teams. Even Sheriff Miller had taken to including the sanctuary in his regular patrols, keeping an eye out for any signs of poaching activity. The federal case against Elijah Carter and his associates had proceeded steadily, with Maggie's testimony about the attack at the fire tower forming a crucial component. Carter faced multiple charges: poaching endangered species, conspiracy to commit wildlife trafficking, assault with a deadly weapon, and most significantly, new charges related to Bobby's death. The forensic re-examination of the scene, coupled with Bobby's own documentation, had provided enough evidence to pursue a case for second-degree murder. "Have you heard from Sarah lately?" Abby asked, referring to Maggie's daughter in Seattle. "She called yesterday. Says she's considering taking a sabbatical from teaching next fall." Maggie couldn't keep the hopeful note from her voice. "She mentioned possibly spending it here, helping with the education program." The educational component had been Maggie's own contribution to the project, a program designed to teach local children and adults about wolves, conservation, and the delicate balance of mountain ecosystems. It felt like a fitting tribute to Bobby's work, making complex scientific concepts accessible to the community he'd loved. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the property, Abby reluctantly departed, leaving Maggie to her evening ritual. With careful movements that respected her still healing shoulder, Maggie made her way down from the deck and along the path that led to the eastern boundary of her land, the direction from which Shadow had always returned from his wilderness excursions. The new bench Bobby's friends from the Forest Service had installed provided a comfortable spot for her vigil. Some nights she brought his journal, reading his observations by the light of a small lantern. Other nights, like tonight, she simply sat in silence, watching and waiting. "I'm not giving up on you," she whispered to the darkening forest. "Take all the time you need." 3 days later, as Maggie was showing the university research team the property boundaries, a distant howl echoed through the valley. Everyone froze, the young graduate students exchanging excited glances while Dr. Chambers immediately reached for her recording equipment. "That came from the northeast ridge," she said, adjusting her directional microphone. "Definitely a wolf, likely an alpha male establishing territory." Maggie said nothing, but her heart raced. After months of silence, hearing a wolf's howl felt significant, regardless of whether it was Shadow. The howl came again, closer this time, followed by a chorus of responses from different directions. "My God," Dr. Chambers breathed, checking her equipment to ensure it was capturing the exchange. "That's pack communication, at least 4, maybe 5 individuals responding to the Alpha's call." The students scribbled notes frantically while the team leader checked the portable weather station they'd installed. "Winds coming from the east at 5 miles per hour. If they're moving with the wind at their backs, they could be approaching the property boundary. We should return to the observation blind." Dr. Chambers decided, already packing up her equipment. "If they're establishing a territory that includes this corridor, we don't want to disrupt their movements with our scent or presence." The team hurried back toward the main cabin, but Maggie lingered, something in that initial howl resonating within her in a way she couldn't explain. "I'll catch up," she called to Dr. Chambers, who hesitated, but ultimately nodded, respecting Maggie's unique position in the project. Alone now. Maggie closed her eyes and listened as the howling continued, the complex vocalizations washing over her like a language just beyond comprehension. One voice stood out from the others, deeper, more resonant, with a distinctive tonal pattern that tugged at her memory. "Shadow," she whispered, the name carried away by the spring breeze. As if in answer, a large black shape emerged from the trees at the forest edge, amber eyes reflecting the late afternoon sunlight. Shadow stood tall and proud, his coat glossy and thick, his posture alert but relaxed. He was leaner than when he'd lived with Maggie, his body honed by months of wild living, but unmistakably the same wolf who had shared her home for 5 years. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to call out, to run toward him, but years of Bobby's teachings about wildlife behavior held her still. This moment needed to be Shadow's choice. For long minutes, wolf and woman regarded each other across the meadow of early wildflowers. Then, with deliberate steps, Shadow began walking toward her, his gait smooth and confident. He stopped about 10 feet away, close enough for Maggie to see the small scar above his right eye, a reminder of their confrontation with Carter at the fire tower. "Hello, old friend," Maggie said softly, tears blurring her vision. Shadow tilted his head, those intelligent amber eyes studying her with recognition that defied scientific explanation. He took another step forward, then another, until he stood directly before her. Slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she chose, he extended his muzzle toward her outstretched hand. The touch, warm breath against her fingers, the familiar texture of his fur broke something open inside Maggie. Tears flowed freely now as Shadow pressed his massive head against her palm in a gesture of trust and connection that transcended the boundaries between their species. "I've missed you," she whispered, the simple words inadequate for the emotion behind them. Movement at the forest edge drew their attention. 4 wolves, 2 adults and 2 gangly adolescents had emerged, watching the interaction with cautious curiosity. The female with the silver chest marking that Maggie had glimpsed months ago took a few tentative steps forward before settling on her haunches, maintaining a watchful but non-aggressive posture. Shadow looked back at Maggie, then toward the waiting wolves, and back again. The meaning was clear even without words. These were his 2 worlds, and for the first time, they were beginning to overlap. In the days that followed, Dr. Chambers and her team documented what they called unprecedented territorial behavior as Shadow's pack established a pattern that included regular visits to the sanctuary property. The wolves never approached the buildings when researchers were present, but trail cameras captured their movements using the wildlife corridor exactly as Bobby had envisioned. While maintaining a respectful distance from human activity, Shadow, however, charted his own course. Every few days, he would appear alone at the edge of Maggie's yard around dusk, sometimes remaining for hours, sometimes just long enough to make his presence known before returning to his pack. He never attempted to enter the cabin as he once had, and Maggie never tried to recapture the domesticated relationship they'd shared. Instead, they forged something new, a connection that honored both his wild nature and their shared history. On a warm evening in early summer, as Maggie sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Shadow appeared with one of the younger wolves from his pack, a gangly yearling with distinctive white markings on its front paws. The younger wolf hung back nervously while Shadow approached the porch with familiar confidence. "Bringing family to visit?" Maggie asked with a smile. As if in answer, Shadow turned to look at the yearling, then back at Maggie, his expression expectant, slowly, respecting the younger wolf's obvious apprehension. Maggie descended the porch steps and knelt in the grass. Shadow moved to her side. His body language relaxed, seemingly demonstrating to his young companion that this human posed no threat. The yearling took a hesitant step forward, then another, its curiosity apparently overcoming fear. Shadow watched the interaction with what Maggie could only describe as pride, his posture alert but calm as the young wolf cautiously sniffed Maggie's extended hand before quickly retreating to a safe distance. "First steps," Maggie murmured, understanding the significance of what had just occurred. Shadow wasn't just visiting, he was building a bridge between his worlds, just as Bobby had once dreamed might be possible. Later that night, after both wolves had disappeared back into the forest. Maggie sat in Bobby's old office surrounded by his research, her own journals, and the notes from Dr. Chambers' team. The full moon illuminated the room through the large windows, casting silver light across the maps and photographs covering the walls. "You were right all along," she said to Bobby's memory. "There was something special about these wolves, about Shadow." From the distant ridge, a chorus of howls rose to greet the moon-wild voices singing ancient songs that had echoed through these mountains long before humans drew their boundaries and built their cabins. Among them, Maggie could distinguish Shadow's distinctive call, neither fully wild nor tame, but something uniquely his own, just like the sanctuary that had once been simply her home, now transformed into something larger and more meaningful than she could have imagined. Just like her own life, reshaped by loss and discovery into a purpose that honored both her past and future. As the howling continued, Maggie opened her journal to a fresh page and began to write, adding her observations to the growing body of knowledge about these remarkable animals. Outside, where the forest met her land, wild and domestic boundaries blurred in the moonlight, two worlds touching, connecting, healing each other one day at a time. Margaret Sullivan's story reminds us that it's never too late to discover a new purpose. At 60, when many of us feel our most meaningful chapters have already been written, life surprised her with an unexpected companion who bridged the gap between her grief and healing. Like Shadow, many of us find ourselves caught between worlds, between who we once were and who we're becoming, between the families we raised and the solitude of later years, between holding on and letting go. Margaret's journey teaches us that loss, even devastating loss, doesn't have to be the end of our story. There can be beauty in the second acts of our lives, often arriving in forms we never anticipated, the courage to open our hearts again, to forge new connections that honor both our past and future. This is the quiet heroism of growing older. Shadow wasn't just a wolf who thought he was a dog. He was a reminder that boundaries are more permeable than we imagine, that love transcends categories, and that sometimes the most healing thing we can do is simply bear witness to another's true nature, allowing them the freedom to be fully themselves while remaining steadfastly present.